argued that if you do not engage in such community protests, you do not get anything. We've come to understand that nothing comes for free. This is our way of life now, otherwise we'll be easily forgotten. So if I can cite just one example, there have been many protests since the 90s in this community. If I can just quote an example of the 2009 community protests. In this protest, the community demanded that the surrounding mines employ more people from the community. They also demanded that the municipal authorities, together with the mines, provide them with basic amenities such as water, health facilities, electricity, etc. And when they engaged in that protest, they blocked the roads, and of course the police came, and there was a bit of violence. But there were some positive outcomes out of this community protest. For example, for the first time in a very long time, the mayor came and addressed the community. And after that, he promised the community that you ensure that there will be what they call Apollo lights or high mast lights. He promised them 8 high mast lights in the community, but unfortunately he delivered only 2. There were also other promises such as water reticulation systems, roads, etc. And Aquarius Mine installed 6 water tanks in the community, which were filled with water twice per week. And Anglo-Plus also provided a mobile clinic, which visited the clinic twice a week. So because of these success, if I may say, because of these successes, the community now believes that for them to become visible, they should constantly engage in these protests. These are just some of the pictures to show the outcomes of some of the protests. The high mast lights, the roads, classroom block. Strata also provided that office for the community, the so-called VIP toilets, and now there's also running water. But what is the meaning of all this? What I can say is that the nature of the community protests in Matabeleland engenders a rethink of the applicability of the concept of insurgent citizenship. Why? Because most of the protests target companies and not national institutions. So one can say it's not really citizenship, but it's possible to view this as protests merely as merely struggles for resources, better service delivery. But again, there are also underlying issues to do with citizenship. All right. If I can just look for just a minute on the dark side of community protests. Although these community protests reap results that members can say there are tangible results out of these community protests, there's also a dark side to these protests. For example, there are some community leaders who just engage or want the community to engage in these protests so that they are recognized. These are so-called protests for recognition. If you engage in a protest, then the community will see that you're a militant leader, and then you can be elected into positions of power. And again, after the 2009 protests, Aquarius, I think, and Anglo-Plus engaged the community, and they came to an agreement that if these mines were going to employ labor, they will start by going to the community and asking the councillor if he has a list of people who are qualified for specific jobs. And the councillor would then submit the CVs of those people. But unfortunately, this system is also being abused by the councillor and his committee. The few people that I talked to were telling me that if you don't pay the councillor, even if the mines want rock drill operators and you are qualified to be a rock drill operator, you won't get the job. You'll be skipped, and somebody who had just arrived from Eastern Cape will get the job before you, even if you have stayed in the community for a very long time. So in conclusion, I can say that informal settlements have emerged on the margins of platinum mines, which have emerged on the margins of platinum mines. They have become typical spaces of insurgent citizenship because they are on the urban peripheries where the poor use various means to assert themselves and to claim their right to the city. There are also areas where the invisible or undesirable urban poor through their everyday experiences, challenge the entrenched. It is also evident that although insurgent practices of the urban poor are rooted in democratic ideals and are aimed at dislodging the entrenched, it is not uncommon for such practices to result in further differentiation and engendering of discourses of inclusion and exclusion. It is through the everyday lives of people living on the margins of these mines that the extent of the impact of mining, of platinum mining in Rustenburg, can be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I guess that shows us the other side of Agnes's story, which is the challenge to these forms of modernity. Andrea Shook.
Do you want to give her the microphone?
Yeah.
While the computer is catching up with the fact that we've changed, I just wanted to introduce my exposure to the South African mining industry. The first time I went to a mine, well, it wasn't there first, but one of the early times I went to a mine site in South Africa. You can tell I'm not from here, I'm from Australia. And I went to a site to pilot a survey tool that we were using in a project I'll be talking about with you shortly. Here it goes. And we were a bit late, as one is wont to be in South Africa when you're dealing with traffic. And there was a group of mine workers who'd waited 3/4 of an hour for us. And in Australia, if mine workers wait 3/4 of an hour, not only do they not do that, but their bosses won't let them because it's too expensive. And I remember thinking, as I saw this rather large group of mine workers waiting for us, oh, this is not like in Australia. This is different. People wait for you here. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means. And what it exposed for me is that while there are many of the same rules, and I'll talk about what I mean by that, it is quite a different game here in terms of health and safety and regulation. And I think you can expand this approach not just to health and safety regulation, but clearly labour regulation more broadly. But I think it might also have some illuminating effects on the ways in which policy and formal rules of whatever sort get operationalised here. Clearly, there's a number of similarities. Between the Australian and South African industry. We both have stable governments. We both have, however, Australia's just changed its government again recently, but we can talk more about that over lunch if you like. We have similar risk-based regulation in health and safety. Both have very active regulators. We have the same key players, and the stories I'm going to tell you today are about pretty well the same companies, and they're very large, very stable organisations, as we've heard quite a bit of yesterday. They obviously have similar internal systems, both in Australia and South Africa, and both nations have strong unions, although again there's a lot more nuance in that than we have time to go into today. But when you look at what you see in South Africa, you have very high fatality rates, you have very high rates of dust-related and lung diseases, and very high injury rates. I'm not going to give you precise figures, because it wouldn't matter what figures I gave you. Sizwe, who I hope is here somewhere, would have more accurate and up-to-date ones. So but I think we'll all agree that the rates are startlingly high here in South Africa. And particularly when you look at the outcomes in Australia. I've just recently been in Western Australia, and there's been the first fatality in the mining industry in 18 months, which has caused absolute uproar. That this is outrageous, how could this happen? It's one fatality in 18 months. Negligible dust diseases, I think again a more nuanced picture, but there's no doubt that the rates of silicosis are almost undetectable in Australia, and remarkably low injury rates, however you might want to define that. Now, the usual knee-jerk reaction, and I've had a bit of this already, is, well, of course, the geology is so different in South Africa to Australia, that's inevitable. And it certainly explains some of the difference, but absolutely by no means all. Most of the traumatic deaths in South Africa are about machinery-human interaction. They're not about seismicity, they're not about death. So that is an absolute, so geology does not explain those incidents. And I certainly don't agree that the disease deaths are entirely explained by geology, and I'll talk more about that if you like over lunch. There's lots of other things going on there that are much more influential than geology. So, the work I've done, as you'll hear about, in Australia and in South Africa, is that, well, what the hell is going on here? Why is it so different? What are the markers? Because traditionally we think, large companies, active unions, strong regulator equals better outcomes for health and safety, and that hasn't happened here in the same way as it did in Australia. Why not? A colleague of mine in Australia, Fiona Haynes, who's I think one of the world's great regulatory theorists, uses the notion of regulatory character, which he takes from a UK academic, Christopher Hood's analysis of looking at different regulatory contexts. And he basically breaks the world up into 4 types of regulatory contexts, which are obviously ideal types. They're not set categories, but I think they illustrate some important aspects that we need to take into account. So as we go up the page, and I hope most of you can see that, I did try and squash the slides up so that you could see. As we go up the page, we're getting increasing formality. Okay? And across the slide, we're getting increasing cooperation, increasing collectivisation. So if we think about the ideal types of regulation, those that are very rule-bound and focused on rules, and also very focused on the collective, are hierarchist. Those that are rule-bound but very individually focused are fatalist. There's the individualist regimes, which are probably very unusual in a regulatory context, but the rules don't matter and it's all about every man or woman for themselves. And then there's the egalitarian context, which are about rules, but also less about rules, more about collective action and working together. And they're obviously ideal types. My colleague Fiona says, well, they're ideal types. What's interesting to analyse is how those different dynamics are played out in a real context. And there's 3 aspects to that we look at. The formal rules and regulations that exist in any regulatory context, and how that interacts with the norms of place that exist within an industry or site, and then what counts as legitimate behaviour for an individual within that context. And there's interplay between all 3, and what's interesting in looking at regulatory context is how those interactions play out. And I have to take issue with something someone said yesterday, and I didn't get the chance in question time to do it, so I apologise if this is a bit cheeky, but there's always a gap between the formal rules and regulation and what happens in the grey space, the grey or black box of the site or the industry. In that context, we're all criminals. Every regulatory context creates criminality. If we define criminality as a difference between what happens in reality and what's expected to happen in the formal rules. So what's interesting in any regulatory context is how does that gap operationalise itself? What counts as norms of place that are so serious as to provoke regulatory action? How do we negotiate that space? Where does the regulator act? The regulator obviously acts on the relationship between the formal rules and the norms of place and the ways individuals operate. So what counts as regulatory action? And that's defined to a very large extent by the social and political pressure that creates the rules, but also the economic and social pressure at a site or industry. And I think that's really the fascinating aspect of looking at why is there a difference. And finally, of course, and we've seen this very much in Australia, that social and political pressure also acts on what people expect a regulator to do and what counts as legitimate regulatory action. So we always know that there's that gap. So what I'm interested in is, given that that blue box at the top, the formal rules and regulations between Australia and South Africa are relatively similar. I mean, there's obviously differences in details in terms of health and safety, but not major differences. It's risk-based, it includes things like the right to refuse dangerous work, and all those things that we have in Australia operate here as well. And yet, that grey box of the site and the industry as a whole does not operate in the same way. I'm very lucky. I've been involved in 2 major studies of how these things are operationalised in the site and in the industry, both in Australia and here. And the study I'm going to talk about in the Australian context is the Digging Deeper study, which I led in the New South Wales mining industry in Australia, which is, all the rhetoric as you have here, committed to achieving world-class health and safety. And I worked with the Tripartite Mine Safety Advisory Committee, who are very helpful and very supportive, but take no responsibility for what I have to say today. In that study, we collected masses of data from 53 sites across New South Wales, all sorts of different parts of the industry, and we've got qualitative and quantitative data of just over 1,500 individual workers at all levels of the industry. The similar study I've been involved with here in South Africa is the Changing Minds project, and some of you may be aware of the culture transformation framework that came out of that now is part of the mining charter here. And it was really around, what does the industry need to do to address those norms of place that I was talking about before. This was funded by the Mine Health and Safety Council, who've been very generous in their support of the project, but again take absolutely no responsibility for what I have to say today. And in fact, you have a photograph there of Sitze Vanderwerder from the Chamber of Mines alongside Siswag Fakati, who's now also at the Chamber of Mines at the Future Search conference we held as part of the project. In the project, we visited and collected enormous amount of data from 32 mine sites across South Africa, did a survey of just over 3,000 workers, and as well, I personally conducted over 100 very detailed in-depth interviews with key industry stakeholders, some of whom were associated with sites, but mostly industry level, so CEOs, union officials, and from within DMR as well. So very quickly, and I'm conscious of time, what did we find? Well, certainly in Australia, we belong definitely on the right-hand side of that. And I would suggest that the tendency in Australia is now very much hierarchist, very rule-bound, very focused, but very socially cohesive. Historically, we were in the egalitarian little box there, I would say, and an interesting aspect is how we moved into hierarchist, but that's for discussion later. There's a very positive and supportive relationship by and large between the inspectorate and the sites. I'm going to focus very much on the metalliferous sites because I think the interesting comparison may well be between the coal industries in the two countries, but that's not what this conference is about. So you can see there, I see the DPI inspector, the equivalent of DMR, maybe 4 times in 18 months. It's a constructive relationship. I'd hate to lose him. You build a rapport. As long as you are striving, improving, and you fund capital projects, it's achievable. And from a worker at a metalliferous site, DPI play a constructive role. They talk to the guys. If you see them, they make things happen. Lest you think everything's rosy, of course, it's much more nuanced than that. And this is from a very poorly performing site where they're very antagonistic between DPI. DPI coming out next week to do a general rule audit. Nothing can be done. We have 20-year-old plants and we probably won't comply with their rules now. It's getting too tough everywhere. We need to kick a few judges into not prosecuting so much. And that's a mine manager.
Sure.
Yeah, very quick, obviously. So, but now in South Africa, I would argue, from our data anyway, it's much more at the left-hand side of that diagram, much more, and I'd suggest probably mostly fatalistic, but I think interestingly some really individualistic aspects to it as well. And that means that there's a real tension between the formal rules and what happens on site, which is largely undiscussed. And there's a real lack of consensus here, I think, about the ways to achieve and monitor regulatory standards, and there's lots of debate and discussion about enforcement strategies by the regulator. I should reinforce, of course, this data is not yesterday, not last week, this is 3 years ago, so things may well have shifted since then, but I suspect there's still an element of truth in what I'm saying. This is from a manager. The DMR approached the mining industry wrongly. They would visit mines to be vindictive, counterproductive, and to actually say, I'm the guy with the big stick. It had no value. They wanted us to believe that by slapping mines with a Section 54 that the safety improved, and they're totally wrong. From a mine worker on a platinum site, you can see that this individualised approach is operationalised by mine workers as well and on site. It's seen as a substitute, in our experience, to controlling risk. If you get injured as a result of your work, it proves that you were working in an unsafe place, therefore you didn't exercise your right to refuse dangerous work, therefore it's your fault you got injured. We heard that logic and that explanation of injury time and time again. And it operationalised in this way. If there is an injury, they may threaten the team that the injured person was working with. They can make them say that they admit that the injured person was working in an unsafe place, and as a group, if we refuse to do that, they threaten to fire us all. Therefore, we cover up and sign those papers. And it's also, I think the really important thing in the context of Marikana is the fact that the consequence of the negotiation around wages and the very large contingent component of people's income. The production bonus, this is from a GM of a large site, so this isn't someone this is someone I think being remarkably honest. The production bonus motivates the workforce to work hard daily, but in return it shifts workers' behaviour from safety. If workers need to blast a face and there is not enough material, they do what they can to blast and make a plan because of the production bonus. As an aside there, if I had heard the term make a plan one more time during this project, I was going to go completely start raving crazy. Yeah, Marikana. So the barriers to change, if you look at this, my analysis of these two industries, obviously the economic importance of mining makes it really hard to change regulatory approaches. And I think the debate about beneficiation is a challenge in that area. The payment systems, and we can talk more about that. Blame seeking, an absolute individualised approach to dealing with this. And I think there's quite serious issues here about what that means in terms of the pressures to change in the industry, but not much time to do that, so we can talk later. Risk acceptance, obviously in an environment with this huge public health problems, people are used and expect things to go wrong and for people to be hurt. Failure to invest in technology, and I'll say this till the cows come home. I understand geology, but this nation has not invested in research in the technology that would allow you to deal with the geology in the same way as other great mining nations have. And I think it's an absolute crime. You had some of the world-leading researchers in this area, and they're just no longer, there's no research or very limited research going on. And I think that's really, to say, oh, it's too hard is an excuse. The lower social expectations of working conditions, which are absolutely supported by high levels of racial and gender labour segmentation, and it is absolutely about gendering. I disagree with Peter, and I took him up at the break, and even though he's left, I'm going to say anyway, that story about the young males who aren't strong enough is exactly about gendering. That is what happens in this industry. There's this expectation that if you're not a real man, not strong enough, you don't belong in this industry. And the sooner, I find that astounding that in Australia, the pressure to change is in fact that you can't rely on people's strengths to control risks, you have to control risks at their source. That pressure doesn't seem to exist here in the same way. I can talk lots about that if you like in the break. So what it means for regulatory reform is first of all that socio-economic context can't be ignored. It's not simply a matter of transposing regulatory strategies from different national environments, and that social change needs to be part of the strategies. You have to examine from Marikana and resolving the enormous challenges that Marikana now presents, moving on from Marikana. So you have to look at the gap between regulation and practice. It's not just about new rules and policy. It's not just about talking about whether we nationalise the industry or not. That's not the issue. The issue is how do we close that gap between what we agree are the right ways of doing things and what actually happens on the site. Challenge the tendency to individualism. It would be, I don't know that you need to be as hierarchical perhaps as we are in Australia, but a little bit more egalitarianism might not go astray. And so you don't reinforce those individualistic norms of place that in my view contributed to the disaster in the first place. So operationalising the right to refuse dangerous work as an excuse for doing things badly is exactly what I'm talking about. And I don't think the answer to health and safety for mining is to have full-time union officials that act as de facto health and safety police officers on site. I think that's a recipe for disaster. And finally, you can't ignore the how when determining the what of policy. Thank you. A word from the sponsors just quickly.
Thank you, Andrew. Last week at the Medical Humanities Conference here at WITS, there was a paper which showed that 20 years of democracy had actually led to declining health conditions for workers, and so all of these elements that you talk about in the grey area are just not kicking in apart from the formal side of it.
I'm happy to talk lots about that.
Okay, we'll take a round of questions. So could I see some hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do that first.
And people say who they are and where they're from.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Eddie Majadi Guru. I'm coming from the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM. Having been a shop steward, a worker, a member, a shop steward, and now an official, I think I carry with me an institutional memory. Having gone through all these phases in the mining sector. and having worked in the mining sector for 21 years. I want to have a small comment and question. The first comment I want to make is that I've been sitting here yesterday and today and listened to all the presentations. And there's one thing that I found missing. And just building up on what one person stated here, that he attended a mining Lokota and then he went to see a seminar or something addressed by the Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, and coming here, and there were 3 different worlds. So just building up on that, I think there's one thing missing, and for me is worrisome, because as a nation, there must always be a baseline from where we move as a country. Now, it is my understanding that in the 50s, they created something called a Freedom Charter, and that mobilized many people. And from the Freedom Charter, today we've got a constitution, and going forward, there was an RDP. What is that we are having today? That as South Africans will say, this is our own identifying with moving forward, that we can defend. I'm raising this thing because if we don't have a baseline from where you move as a country, it can be a political, it can be economic or social. The danger of that is that you are going to have every Dick and Tom coming to you and say, we've got this for you, take and apply. We've got this for you, take and apply. And we are going to be a nation that is in constant search for its identity. And that's going to be a problem. I'm saying this because everybody were waking, and I think maybe it was necessary, were being waken up by Marikana. Everybody is running around. You go everywhere, it's Marikana, Marikana. Where were we all the time? Because it is my understanding that research must be forward-looking. But forward-looking, it must be saying to us, these are the developments. And if they're not addressed in the following times and so on, we could have a serious problem. I know that some people have raised those issues, but to what extent have we discussed them? To what extent have we influenced policy direction such that we are able to address them in time? I thought I must raise that point. Because if you don't have that kind of a baseline, and I'm going to the next point to say, I was listening, for example, from yesterday until today, there was this issue of living out allowance. And I want to challenge people. Because the way it is being presented, and thanks,